The first-class cabin buzzed with quiet luxury as travelers settled into their plush seats, sipping champagne and adjusting their designer luggage. Among them sat a man whose simple attire and calm demeanor made him stand out, not in a glamorous way, but in a way that drew whispers and curious glances. Denzel Washington, dressed as though he were just another passenger, went unnoticed by most, but not by Marcus Grayson. Marcus was a man who wore his achievements like armor. At 38, he had risen through the ranks of a prestigious tech firm with a ruthless efficiency that left competitors and colleagues alike in his wake. His tailored charcoal suit spoke of custom fittings in Manhattan shops where most people couldn't afford to browse. His titanium watch, limited edition, he would tell you without prompting, peeked from beneath a crisp white cuff secured with gold links. Everything about Marcus had been carefully selected to communicate a single message: importance. As he settled into seat 3A, he surveyed the cabin with the practiced indifference of someone accustomed to luxury. This Los Angeles to New York red-eye was a monthly ritual for him, a necessary inconvenience in his bi-coastal existence. First class wasn't a privilege to Marcus, it was a requirement, a baseline expectation for someone of his stature. "Can I offer you a pre-flight beverage, Mr. Grayson?" The flight attendant's practiced smile flashed white against her burgundy lipstick. "Scotch. Neat. The Macallan, if you have it." He didn't look up from his phone as he spoke, his fingers dancing across the screen as he responded to emails that couldn't wait the 5 minutes until takeoff. The cabin filled gradually, each new arrival assessed and categorized by Marcus in quick glances. Venture capitalist, fashion executive, old money coasting on family wealth. He played this silent game of categorization as a way to situate himself within what he viewed as the natural hierarchy of success. And then there was the man who slid into seat 3B beside him. The first thing Marcus noticed was the lack of designer logo, lack of ostentation, lack of the markers he used to identify people of consequence. The man wore a simple navy sweater over a white t-shirt, jeans that looked comfortable rather than fashionable, and sneakers that spoke of practical use rather than status. His only luggage appeared to be a weathered leather backpack, which he carefully stowed beneath the seat in front of him. "Evening," the man said, his voice a warm baritone that carried the subtle confidence of someone who didn't need to assert his presence. His eyes, gentle but penetrating, met Marcus's for a brief moment. "Evening," Marcus returned flatly, already dismissing his seatmate as someone who'd somehow lucked into a first-class upgrade. Probably used points, he thought dismissively, or maybe traveling on someone else's dime. The flight attendant returned, placing Marcus's scotch on his armrest with a cocktail napkin emblazoned with the airline's logo. "And for you, sir?" she asked, turning to the man in 3B. "Just water, thank you," he replied. Marcus couldn't suppress a small, derisive smile. Water. In first class. It confirmed his suspicion. This man was out of his element. As the cabin door closed with a definitive thunk and the safety briefing began, Marcus found his attention repeatedly drawn to his seatmate. There was something about him, a stillness that seemed at odds with the constant motion and status signaling around them. The man simply sat, occasionally looking out the window as the ground crews scurried about in their final preparations, his hands resting easily in his lap. "Business in New York?" Marcus finally asked, more to satisfy his curiosity than from any genuine interest in conversation. The man turned, his eyes crinkling slightly at the corners. "Something like that. A meeting. So I've been looking forward to." "What industry?" Marcus pressed, already mentally filing through possibilities. "Not finance, certainly not with that outfit. Not tech." Marcus knew everyone who mattered in that sphere. Perhaps some creative field, though he lacked the affected eccentricity of that crowd. "Entertainment," the man replied simply. Marcus's interest sparked slightly. Entertainment, what aspect? Production, distribution? Here was something he could engage with. His firm had recently begun exploring media acquisitions. "A bit of everything, I suppose. I've been in the industry a long time." There was no boasting in the statement, just a simple fact offered without elaboration. Marcus nodded, his initial assessment shifting slightly. Perhaps this was someone who worked behind the scenes, one of those invisible but essential figures who made the industry function. It's a volatile business model. Not like tech. We create tangible value, measurable outcomes. Entertainment is all smoke and mirrors, wouldn't you say? Something flickered in the man's eyes. Not offense, but perhaps amusement. I suppose it depends on how you measure value, he answered. Entertainment connects people to their humanity. That's tangible in its own way. Marcus waved this philosophical response away with a flick of his wrist. Sentiment doesn't show up on a balance sheet, he said, taking a sip of his scotch. At the end of the day, it's all about the numbers. The man nodded thoughtfully. Numbers. A matter, he agreed, but so do the stories we tell. As the plane began to taxi, Marcus found himself unexpectedly irritated. There was a quiet confidence in this man that seemed unearned, at least by the metrics Marcus understood. Success in his world announced itself. It wasn't hidden beneath understated clothing and philosophical platitudes. You don't come to first class often, do you? Marcus asked, the question barbed beneath a veneer of casual conversation. The man's expression remained unchanged, his eyes meeting Marcus's directly. What makes you say that? Marcus gestured vaguely. Just an observation. Most regulars have their routines, preferences. They understand the value of what they're paying for. And you think I don't? Water? Marcus pointed out with a small smirk. When you could have anything. The man smiled, a genuine expression that somehow made Marcus feel as though he was the one who had missed something important. Sometimes water is exactly what you need. As the plane accelerated down the runway, Marcus felt an unexpected need to establish his position, to make this unassuming man understand exactly who he was sitting next to. I'm Marcus Grayson, by the way, VP of Strategic Development at Axiom. Tech? He waited for the recognition, the subtle shift that usually came when people placed him in the tech world's ecosystem. Instead, the man simply extended his hand. Nice to meet you, Marcus. I'm Denzel. The name registered vaguely, but in the context of their conversation, Marcus merely filed it away as another data point about this curious seatmate. He didn't make the connection. Not yet. As the plane climbed steeply into the night sky, the lights of Los Angeles spreading out below them like a glittering circuit board, Marcus noticed something odd. The flight attendants, moving efficiently through the cabin, seemed to pay special attention to the man beside him. Their professional courtesy carried an undercurrent of something else, respect, perhaps, or recognition. Sir, is there anything else I can get you? One of them asked, her attention focused entirely on Marcus's seatmate. Her tone was different, warmer somehow. I'm fine, thank you, he responded with genuine appreciation. Marcus frowned slightly. Something wasn't adding up. As the seatbelt sign pinged off and the cabin settled into the rhythm of the flight, he felt a nagging curiosity about the man beside him. There was more to this Denzel than met the eye, and Marcus, who prided himself on reading people and situations, was determined to figure out exactly what it was. Little did he know that his assumptions were about to be dramatically overturned, and that this routine flight would become a lesson in humility that would change his perspective forever. The plane leveled off at cruising altitude, the subtle shift in engine noise signaling the beginning of the long journey east. Marcus adjusted his seat to a more comfortable position, the soft leather conforming to his back as he took another sip of his scotch. The warm burn of the alcohol strengthened his resolve to understand the puzzle sitting beside him. So, Denzel, Marcus began, turning slightly to face his seatmate, you mentioned you're in entertainment. Actor? Producer? His tone carried a hint of skepticism, as if he'd already decided the answer couldn't be particularly impressive. Denzel looked up from the book he'd just opened, his expression neutral but attentive. I've done some acting, he responded simply. Anything I might have seen? Marcus pressed, his lips curving into a small, condescending smile. Perhaps, Denzel said with a modest shrug. I've been fortunate to work on some projects that connected with audiences. Marcus nodded dismissively. In his experience, genuine success required no modesty. The truly accomplished made sure you knew exactly who they were and what they'd achieved. This man's understated responses only confirmed his initial assessment. Probably a bit player, maybe someone who'd had a few lines in commercials or as an extra in the background. I work with some major studios, Marcus volunteered, though Denzel hadn't asked. My firm is looking at acquiring a production company. The entertainment industry needs more discipline, more business acumen. Too many creatives burning through capital without understanding ROI. That's one perspective, Denzel acknowledged, though creativity and commerce have always had a complex relationship. Not complex at all, Marcus countered, warming to his subject. Entertainment is just another product. The problem is that too many people in your industry don't understand basic market principles. A flight attendant approached, offering hot towels. As she handed one to Denzel, her professional demeanor shifted subtly. A genuine smile, a moment of lingering eye contact. "It's an honor having you on board, sir," she said quietly. "Thank you," Denzel responded warmly. "I appreciate the kind service." Marcus watched this interaction with growing curiosity. The deference shown to his seatmate didn't align with his shabby appearance or modest demeanor. As the flight attendant moved on, Marcus's determination to solve this incongruity intensified. "You know," Marcus said, lowering his voice conspiratorially, "I've always found the film industry fascinating from an outsider's perspective. All that glitz covering up what's essentially a house of cards. One bad movie and careers vanish overnight." Denzel considered this, gently dabbing his hands with the hot towel. "There's certainly volatility," he agreed, "but that's true of most creative endeavors. Risk and reward often walk hand in hand." "That's why I prefer tech," Marcus said with a self-satisfied smile. "We build things that last, innovations that change how people live, not just entertainment that's forgotten the moment the credits roll." Something subtle shifted in Denzel's expression. Not offense, but perhaps a quiet recognition of Marcus's limited perspective. "Some films stay with people for a lifetime," he said. "They shape how we see ourselves and each other. That's not insignificant." Marcus waved this away. Sentiment again. At the end of the day, it's all just distraction. People looking for an escape from their ordinary lives. Or perhaps, Denzel countered gently, they're looking for reflection, for stories that help them make sense of their experiences. Art has always served that purpose. Marcus felt a flash of irritation. This man, this nobody, was challenging him, and with such calm certainty that it felt almost condescending. "Let's be real," he said, his tone sharpening. "Most of what Hollywood produces is formulaic garbage designed to separate people from their money. And actors, they're just pretty faces reciting words someone else wrote." The words hung in the air between them, the harsh assessment aimed directly at Denzel's claimed profession. Marcus watched for the reaction he expected. Defensiveness, perhaps, or wounded pride. Instead, Denzel simply nodded thoughtfully. "There's certainly commercial pressure," he acknowledged. "But even within those constraints, meaningful work happens. I've witnessed it." The dinner service began, interrupting their conversation. Marcus ordered the filet mignon without looking. At the menu, Denzel selected the fish option, thanking the attendant with genuine appreciation. "So," Marcus said, after their meals had been served, cutting into his steak with precise movements, "what exactly do you do in this industry you're so philosophical about? Bit parts, background work?" "I've had leading roles," Denzel said, his tone matter-of-fact rather than boastful. "I've been fortunate to work with some remarkable directors and writers over the years." Marcus raised an eyebrow, skepticism plain on his face. "Leading roles in what exactly? Student films, community theater?" A passenger across the aisle glanced over, her expression surprised. Another, a few seats ahead, turned slightly, listening. "Feature films, mostly," Denzel replied, seemingly untroubled by Marcus's increasingly dismissive tone. "Some theater work as well." "Anything with actual distribution?" Marcus pressed, his voice carrying just enough to attract more attention from nearby passengers. "Or are we talking about the kind of films that play to empty rooms at obscure festivals?" The woman across the aisle made a small, shocked sound. The man ahead turned further in his seat, no longer pretending not to listen. Denzel's calm remained unshaken. "They've had theatrical releases, yes." "And yet here you are," Marcus said with a slight smirk, gesturing to Denzel's simple attire, "flying commercial like the rest of us. Must not have been very successful films." The cabin had grown noticeably quieter. A flight attendant hovered. Nearby, her expression concerned. Marcus, focused on his interrogation, failed to notice the shift in atmosphere. "Success comes in many forms," Denzel said, his voice still even. "Box office numbers are just one measure." "The only measure that matters," Marcus countered. "Everything else is just consolation for failures." Denzel studied him for a moment, his gaze direct but not unkind. "What are you hoping to achieve with this conversation, Marcus?" The question caught Marcus off guard. He'd expected defensiveness, maybe even embarrassment, not this calm inquiry that somehow made him feel as though he was the one being examined. "Just making conversation," he said, suddenly aware of the attention they'd attracted. "Getting to know my seatmate, are you?" Denzel asked. "Or are you trying to establish some sort of hierarchy between us?" The directness of the question left Marcus momentarily speechless. Before he could formulate a response, a flight attendant approached, leaning down slightly. "Mr. Washington," she said with quiet respect, "the captain asked if you'd like to visit the cockpit once we're closer to our destination. He's a huge fan of your work." The words hung in the air as Marcus froze, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth, the implications of what he'd just heard slowly registering in his mind. Washington. Mr. Washington. Denzel Washington. The pieces clicked into place with jarring clarity. The respectful treatment from the crew, the calm confidence, the evasive answers about acting. Marcus had spent the last hour condescendingly lecturing one of the most acclaimed actors of his generation about the film industry. As the flight attendant moved away, Denzel turned to Marcus, his expression unchanged, still composed, still dignified, despite the barrage of dismissive comments he'd weathered. "Now," Denzel said gently, "shall we continue our conversation?" Marcus stared at Denzel Washington, his mouth slightly agape, his mind racing to process this revelation. The scotch in his glass suddenly seemed insufficient for the situation. How had he not recognized one of the most famous actors in the world? The dim cabin lighting, the casual attire, the baseball cap, these might explain the oversight, but they couldn't excuse the torrent of condescension he'd directed at the man. You're... Marcus stammered, his usual eloquence deserting him. "I didn't realize." Denzel's expression remained unchanged, neither gloating nor offended. "Does it matter?" he asked simply. The question hung between them, weighted with meaning beyond its surface simplicity. Marcus fumbled for the expected response, an apology perhaps, or backpedaling. But something in Denzel's gaze suggested he was looking for a more thoughtful answer. "I suppose it shouldn't," Marcus finally managed, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. Denzel nodded slightly. "Yet it does. To most people." He took a sip of water, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "That's worth thinking about, isn't it?" The plane hit a patch of turbulence, the cabin shuddering briefly before settling again. The physical jolt mirrored the internal disruption Marcus felt. His carefully constructed worldview, one where success must be visible, where worth was measured in possessions and status, had just been directly challenged by a living contradiction to his beliefs. "I owe you an apology," Marcus said, reaching. There was the script society had prepared for such situations. "What I said about actors, about the industry, I was out of line. Because of who I am?" Denzel asked, his tone genuinely curious rather than accusatory. "Well, yes," Marcus answered reflexively, then paused. "I mean, would those opinions have been acceptable if I were exactly who you initially thought I was? Someone of no consequence to your world?" The question struck Marcus with unexpected force. He'd been prepared for anger, for the wounded ego he himself would have displayed. But this philosophical inquiry, this gentle prodding at the foundation of his beliefs, it left him unbalanced. "That's not what I meant," he tried again. "What did you mean then?" Denzel's voice remained even, his expression open rather than judgmental. Marcus took a deep breath, then a long sip of his scotch, buying time. The cabin around them had resumed its normal rhythm, the momentary spotlight on their interaction having faded. Yet Marcus felt exposed, as though Denzel's simple questions had stripped away his carefully tailored armor. "I suppose," he began slowly, "I did think differently of you once I knew who you were." Denzel nodded, acknowledging the honesty. "That's human nature to some extent. We categorize, we prioritize based on perceived value. He leaned back in his seat, his posture relaxed but attentive. The question is whether we should. Of course we should, Marcus replied, finding firmer footing in this abstract discussion. It's efficient. You can't treat everyone the same way. There aren't enough hours in the day, enough resources to go around. Is that what you were doing? Being efficient? There was no mockery in Denzel's tone, only genuine curiosity. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. I was making assumptions, he admitted, based on appearance, on external markers of success. Yes. And how has that approach served you over the years? Denzel asked. Has it led you to meaningful connections? To insights you might have missed otherwise? The question pierced deeper than Marcus expected. His mind flashed to business relationships cultivated purely for advantage, to conversations assessed only for their potential utility, to the loneliness that sometimes ambushed him in quiet moments, despite his material success. It served me professionally, he answered carefully. And personally. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight entered its nighttime phase. In this softer lighting, Denzel's features seemed more pronounced. The thoughtful eyes, the composure. That spoke of inner security rather than external validation. That's a complicated question, Marcus deflected. The most important ones usually are? Denzel smiled slightly. You know, in my work I've played all sorts of men. Good, evil, complex, simple. The one thing I've learned is that the most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves. Marcus felt a flicker of defensiveness. I'm not lying to myself. No. Denzel's tone was gentle. When you judge someone's worth by their clothes or their title or their bank account, is that truth, or is it a convenient fiction that allows you to navigate a complex world through shortcuts? Another bout of turbulence shook the plane, more pronounced this time. Several passengers gripped their armrests. A flight attendant's voice came over the intercom asking everyone to ensure their seatbelts were fastened. Marcus tightened his reflexively, grateful for the momentary distraction. Look, Marcus said when the plane steadied, the world rewards certain things. Success, achievement, status. That's not fiction. It's reality. The world is what we collectively make it, Denzel countered. And yes, it often rewards those things. But at what cost? What are we sacrificing on that altar of status? Marcus felt oddly cornered, though Denzel's demeanor remained entirely non-confrontational. That sounds like the philosophy of someone who's already achieved success, he said, a hint of his earlier sharpness returning. Easy to dismiss the ladder once you've climbed it. Denzel nodded thoughtfully. Fair point, though I'd suggest that my perspective comes less from having made it and more from having seen the emptiness of success without purpose. He paused, his gaze momentarily distant. I've known many successful people who were profoundly unhappy, and I've known plenty of unsuccessful people in the same state, Marcus countered. True enough, Denzel agreed. Material comfort doesn't create misery, but neither does it prevent it. The question is whether what we're pursuing is actually what we need. The conversation paused as a flight attendant approached, refilling Denzel's water and offering Marcus another scotch, which he declined with a slight shake of his head. For the first time in recent memory, he wanted clarity rather than comfort. So what is it we need, in your philosophy? Marcus asked when they were alone. Again, surprised to find himself genuinely curious about the answer. Connection, Denzel said without hesitation. Purpose, the sense that our presence in this world matters beyond what we accumulate or achieve. He smiled slightly. The things that would matter to you, even if no one ever knew about them. Marcus considered this. Those are abstract concepts, but their absence is concretely felt, Denzel replied. Have you never accomplished something significant, a promotion, a deal, a purchase, only to find the satisfaction hollow? The question struck with unexpected precision. Marcus remembered his recent acquisition of a beach house in the Hamptons, a trophy property he'd visited only twice since purchase, each time hosting colleagues who needed to be impressed, rather than friends he actually enjoyed. Sometimes, he admitted, that hollow feeling is the gap between what we think will fulfill us and what actually does, Denzel said. It's the space where philosophy becomes practical, not abstract at all. Marcus was silent for a moment, turning these words over in his calm mind. So you're saying success itself is empty? I'm saying success needs definition beyond external metrics, Denzel clarified. When I finish a role, the question isn't whether it won awards or made money, though those things matter in their context. The real question is whether it said something true about the human experience, whether it connected. And if it doesn't, win awards or make money, Marcus challenged. Denzel smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his face. Then my definition of success helps me weather disappointment with my dignity intact, a victory either way. The simplicity and wisdom of this perspective left Marcus momentarily speechless. Before he could formulate a response, the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing expected turbulence ahead and requesting that passengers remain seated, with seatbelts fastened. As the plane began to shudder more violently, Marcus found himself wondering if the turbulence inside him might prove more consequential than the disrupted air outside. The turbulence subsided gradually, the plane finding smoother air as it continued its eastward journey. The cabin settled back into its rhythm, the soft murmur of conversations resuming around them. Marcus sat quietly, still processing Denzel's words about success and fulfillment. There was something disarming about the man's calm certainty, his lack of defensiveness, even in the face of Marcus's earlier condescension. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus finally said, breaking the silence between them. Denzel nodded, his attention focused entirely on Marcus, despite the subtle fatigue around his eyes that suggested he might have preferred rest. "Why didn't you just tell me who you were from?" "The beginning. It would have saved us both." Marcus trailed off, unsure how to characterize their earlier interaction. "An uncomfortable conversation," Denzel suggested with a slight smile. "Something like that." Denzel considered the question, his expression thoughtful. "I found that people interact differently with Denzel Washington than they do with just another passenger. Sometimes it's refreshing to just be a person rather than a persona." "But you must have known what I was thinking," Marcus pressed. "That I was dismissing you based on your appearance." "I had some idea," Denzel acknowledged, "but that's more revealing about you than it is about me, isn't it?" The observation, delivered without malice but with unflinching directness, struck Marcus with unexpected force. He'd been so concerned with his own embarrassment that he hadn't fully considered what his behavior revealed about his character. "I'm not usually like that," Marcus said, a defensive note creeping into his voice. "It's been a stressful week." "We're all at our most authentic when we think the stakes are low," Denzel replied. "When we believe our words or actions don't matter, because the person across from us doesn't matter." Marcus opened his mouth to protest, then closed it again. There was truth in Denzel's words that he couldn't easily dismiss. The flight attendant approached their row, her professional demeanor subtly different when addressing Denzel. "Mr. Washington will be serving breakfast in about 2 hours. Would you prefer to be woken up for it, or would you rather sleep?" "I'll probably be awake," Denzel replied with a warm smile. "But thank you for asking." "Of course. And can I just say," she added, lowering her voice slightly, "my mother and I watched Remember the Titans every Thanksgiving. Your performance meant a lot to our family." Denzel's expression softened with genuine appreciation. "That's very kind of you to share. It means a lot to hear that." As the flight attendant moved on, Marcus observed the interaction with new awareness. The respect Denzel received wasn't just celebrity deference. There was something more personal in it, a recognition of impact beyond fame. "That happens to you a lot," Marcus said. It wasn't a question. "Sometimes," Denzel acknowledged. "It's humbling. People invite our performances into their lives, make them part of their family traditions, their memories." "Is that why you do it?" "The connection with audiences? Partly," Denzel said. "But it's also about the stories themselves, what they say, what they mean. I've been fortunate to portray characters with strength, dignity, moral purpose." He paused, his gaze directed inward. "Roles that reflect something essential about the human experience." Marcus nodded slowly, beginning to understand something he hadn't before. "You said earlier that success needs definition beyond external metrics. For you, it's about the message, the meaning." "Among other things," Denzel agreed, "though I wouldn't claim to have it all figured out. We're all works in progress. The humility in this statement, coming from someone who had achieved what most would consider extraordinary success, struck Marcus deeply. He thought about his own markers of achievement, the title, the salary, the possessions, and felt a strange emptiness he'd previously attributed to the need for greater accomplishment. More, bigger, better had always been his solution to that hollow feeling. Their conversation was interrupted as a man from across the aisle approached, hesitating slightly before addressing Denzel. "I'm sorry to intrude," he said, his expression both embarrassed and determined, "but I just wanted to say thank you." He glanced at Marcus briefly before continuing. "My son is in the military, and after he came back from his second tour, he was struggling. Wouldn't talk to anyone, not even his mother or me." Denzel listened attentively, his focus complete. "We were watching Fences one night," the man continued, "and there was something about your performance, the scene with your son, that broke through to him. He started talking that night, really talking for the first time in months." The man's voice wavered slightly. "The doctors say that moment was a turning point, so thank you." Denzel stood, extending his hand. "Thank you for sharing that with me," he said, his voice carrying genuine emotion. "Please thank your son for his service and for his courage, both in uniform and afterward." The brief interaction concluded with a handshake, the man returning to his seat visibly moved. Denzel sat down again, his expression reflective rather than prideful. Marcus had watched the exchange with growing awareness. The revelation wasn't just that he was sitting next to Denzel Washington, one of the most acclaimed actors of his generation. The true revelation was witnessing firsthand how Denzel's work had tangibly affected lives, not in the abstract way Marcus sometimes claimed his own work improved user experiences or optimized engagement metrics, but in profound human terms. "That's not the first time you've heard something like that," Marcus said softly. "No," Denzel agreed, "it's not, and each time it's both humbling and clarifying." "Clarifying how?" "That reminds me why the work matters beyond the industry metrics we discussed earlier." Denzel's gaze was direct but kind. "Success that touches lives has a different weight to it than success that merely accumulates." The cabin lights dimmed further as they entered the heart of the overnight journey. Around them, passengers reclined their seats, donned eye masks, and settled into sleep. But Marcus felt more awake than he had in years, his mind working through implications he'd never considered. "I build software," he said after a long pause. "Analytics platforms mostly. Nothing that changes lives like what you do." "Everything. We create affects others in some way," Denzel responded. "The question is whether we're conscious of that impact, whether we take responsibility for it." "I'm not sure I've thought about it that way," Marcus admitted. "Most people don't," Denzel said without judgment. "We get caught up in the metrics our industries value: market share, quarterly growth, critical acclaim, box office returns. But those are means, not ends. The end being? A life of meaning, of contribution." Denzel smiled slightly. "Of good work done well, for purposes that matter." Marcus considered this, feeling something shift within him, a perspective tilting, a value system rearranging itself in real time. All his life, he'd measured success in accumulation and recognition. But sitting beside this man who embodied a different kind of achievement, he felt the hollowness of his own definition. "I think I've been asking myself the wrong questions," Marcus said finally, the admission surprisingly easy to make. "What questions should you be asking?" Denzel's tone was curious rather than prescriptive. Marcus was silent for a moment, genuinely reflecting. "Maybe not, how successful am I? But what am I succeeding at? What am I building or contributing to?" Denzel nodded, his expression suggesting Marcus had touched on something essential. "Those questions have power," he said simply. "They can change trajectories." As the plane continued its journey through the night sky, Marcus felt as though he too was traveling somewhere unexpected, not just from Los Angeles to New York, but from one understanding of his life to another, more meaningful one. The revelation wasn't just about Denzel's identity. It was about the possibility of a different way of measuring what mattered. "Thank you," Marcus said quietly, "for not taking offense earlier, for the conversation." "Thank you for being open to it," Denzel replied. "Not everyone is." In the dimly lit cabin, surrounded by sleeping passengers, Marcus felt strangely, unexpectedly, awake. "Excuse me for a moment," Marcus said, feeling a sudden need for space. The revelation of Denzel's identity and the subsequent conversation had created a pressure in his chest, a mixture of embarrassment and something deeper he couldn't yet name. Denzel nodded, understanding in his eyes. "So, of course." Marcus unbuckled his seatbelt and made his way to the first-class lavatory, grateful to find it unoccupied. He locked the door behind him and stood before the small mirror, finally confronting his own reflection. The face that stared back was familiar, yet somehow foreign. His carefully styled hair, the expensive watch, the tailored shirt, all the markers of success he'd cultivated, suddenly seemed like props in a performance he'd been giving his entire adult life. "What are you doing, Marcus?" he whispered to his reflection. The cramped bathroom of an airplane at 35,000 feet was an unlikely place for existential reflection, but perhaps that was fitting. Stripped of his usual contexts, the corner office, the exclusive restaurants, the luxury condo, he was forced to see himself without the usual trappings that defined him. He thought back to his earlier interactions with Denzel, cringing at the memory of his condescending tone, his dismissive assumptions. How many others had he judged this way? How many connections, insights, and relationships had he missed because he'd decided in an instant that someone wasn't worth his full attention? Marcus splashed cold water on his face, the shock of it bringing a momentary clarity. He'd built his life around the pursuit of status markers that, he now realized, offered diminishing returns. Each promotion, bonus, or luxury purchase provided a briefer high than the last, requiring ever more acquisition to maintain the same sense of achievement. Yet in just one conversation, Denzel Washington had challenged that entire framework with a perspective that was both simpler and more profound. Success that touched lives versus success that merely accumulated. The memory of the passenger thanking Denzel returned to him, the raw emotion in the man's voice as he described how a performance had helped his struggling son. When was the last time Marcus's work had affected someone that deeply? Had it ever? He dried his face with a paper towel, his movements deliberate as he tried to organize his thoughts. This wasn't just about being embarrassed in front of a celebrity. It was about recognizing a fundamental emptiness in the way he'd been measuring his life's worth. A gentle knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Just a minute," he called, taking one last look at himself before unlocking the door. Outside, a middle-aged woman waited patiently. As Marcus stepped aside to let her pass, their eyes met briefly. In that moment, Marcus realized he would normally have looked through her rather than at her, another person deemed irrelevant to his concerns, invisible except as an obstacle or tool. "Thank you," she said with a small smile. "You're welcome," Marcus replied, the simple exchange carrying an unfamiliar weight in his heightened state of awareness. As he made his way back to his seat, Marcus observed the sleeping cabin with new eyes. Each passenger represented a complete life, hopes, fears, accomplishments, struggles, all as real and significant as his own. This obvious truth, something children understood instinctively but adults often forgot, struck him with the force of revelation. Denzel was reading when Marcus returned, a worn paperback open in his hands. He looked up as Marcus settled back into his seat, his expression neutral but attentive. "Everything all right?" Denzel asked. "Yes," Marcus said, then reconsidered. "Actually, no. I've been thinking about what you said, about how we treat people differently based on who we think they are." He paused, searching for the right words. "I think I've been doing that my whole career, my whole life, really." Denzel closed his book, giving Marcus his full attention. "It's a common pattern," he said, his tone free of judgment. "Our culture encourages it in many ways." "That doesn't make it right," Marcus replied, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "No," Denzel agreed. "It doesn't." Marcus was quiet for a moment, organizing his thoughts. "When I was younger, starting out in tech, I was on the other side of it. Senior executives would look right through me in meetings, dismiss my ideas without hearing them. I promised myself that when I made it, I'd be different." He laughed softly, the sound carrying no humor. Somewhere along the way I became exactly what I resented. Recognition is the first step toward change, Denzel observed. I'm not sure how to change something so ingrained, Marcus admitted. It's almost reflexive at this point, sizing people up, categorizing them based on their usefulness to me or my status relative to theirs. Like any habit, Denzel said, it changes with conscious practice. Awareness, then intention, then new action. Marcus nodded slowly. I was 32 when I got my first executive role, he said, the memory suddenly vivid. I'd worked 80-hour weeks for years, sacrificed relationships, health, everything to get there. When it finally happened, I thought, now I'll be happy. Now I'll feel like I've arrived. And did you? Denzel asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. For about 2 weeks, Marcus said with a rueful smile. Then it was all about the next promotion, the next title, the next salary bracket. The goalpost keeps moving. It always does when the metrics are external, Denzel observed. There's always someone with more, always another level to climb. The truth of this settled heavily on Marcus. He thought of colleagues who had achieved even more than he had. The C-suite executives, the founders with 8-figure exits, and how many of them seemed just as restless, just as hungry for validation as he was. I had this moment a few months ago, Marcus said, surprising himself with the confession. I was hosting a dinner party at my place in Manhattan, all executives, all the right people to know. Everything was perfect. The catering, the wine, the view of the park. I excused myself at one point and just stood in my bedroom, looking at these people laughing and networking, and I thought, none of them would be here if I lost my position tomorrow. Denzel nodded, understanding in his eyes. The friendships of convenience. Exactly. And then I realized I was there for the same reasons they were. Not genuine connection, just strategic relationship building. Marcus shook his head slightly. I went right back out and rejoined the conversation, pushed the thought away. Those moments of clarity can be uncomfortable, Denzel said. It's easier to ignore them, to keep moving within the familiar patterns. Even when those patterns aren't making us happy, Marcus added. Especially then, Denzel agreed. Change requires admitting that our current path isn't working. That's a difficult truth to face. The cabin lights remained dim, most passengers lost in sleep around them. In this muted environment, the conversation felt intimate, protected from the harsh light of day that might have made such admissions more difficult. I'm not sure what to do with these realizations, Marcus confessed. It's not like I can just walk away from my career, my life. Perhaps it's not about walking away, but about bringing new awareness to it, Denzel suggested. About making choices consciously rather than automatically. About defining success in terms that actually matter to you. Marcus considered this. And what does success look like to you? He asked. Beyond what you've already shared about your work? Denzel was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Integrity, he said finally. Living in alignment with my values. Being the same person in public and in private. Using whatever influence I have to create opportunities for others. He smiled slightly. And at the end of the day, being someone my family can be proud of, not just for what I've achieved, but for how I've achieved it. The simplicity and clarity of this response resonated with Marcus in a way he hadn't expected. It contrasted sharply with the complex calculations he used to measure his own worth, market compensation comparisons, status symbols, power dynamics. That sounds... Marcus searched for the right word. Sustainable, Denzel nodded. It is. External validation comes and goes. The industry is fickle, critics change their minds, audiences move on to the next thing. But living with integrity, making work that matters, treating people with dignity regardless of what they can do for you, that sustains you through the inevitable ups and downs. As the plane continued its journey through the night, Marcus felt something shift within him, not a complete transformation, but the beginning of a questioning that might, with time and attention, lead to meaningful change. The cabin remained hushed as the plane continued its journey across the darkened continent. Most passengers were asleep, their seats reclined, eye masks in place wrapped in airline blankets against the cabin's chill. Marcus, however, felt more awake than he had in years, his mind processing the unexpected turn his journey had taken. Denzel had closed his eyes briefly, though Marcus suspected he wasn't fully asleep. There was something about his presence, a watchfulness, a quiet alertness, that suggested he was simply resting while remaining aware of his surroundings. The flight attendant moved through the cabin with practiced quiet, checking on the few passengers who remained awake. She paused beside their row, her voice a respectful whisper. "Can I get either of you anything?" Denzel opened his eyes, offering her a warm smile. "I'm fine, thank you." "Some water, please," Marcus said, realizing he was thirsty. As she moved away to fetch his water, Denzel shifted in his seat, turning slightly toward Marcus. "You know, your question earlier, about how I handle success, it's something I've thought about a lot over the years." Marcus nodded, encouraging him to continue. "When I was starting out," Denzel said, his voice low enough not to disturb the sleeping passengers around them, "I had this idea that success would be a destination, that I'd reach a certain point, and then I'd have made it." He smiled slightly at the memory. "I was fortunate enough to find some success relatively early, but it didn't feel the way I'd expected." "How so?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious. "It was both more and less than I'd imagined. More opportunities, yes, but also more expectations, more scrutiny. And it didn't resolve the fundamental questions about purpose, about contribution, about what truly matters." Denzel paused as the flight attendant returned with Marcus's water, thanking her with a nod before continuing. "I realized that success wasn't a destination but a responsibility." Marcus took a sip of water, considering this perspective. A responsibility to whom? To the craft itself, to the audiences who give their time and attention, to the stories that need telling. Denzel's expression grew more serious. "And especially to those coming after me, who might not get the same opportunities if I didn't use my position to help create pathways." "You mean other black actors?" Marcus asked. "Them, certainly. But more broadly, anyone struggling against a system that wasn't designed with them in mind." Denzel's voice carried no bitterness, only a clear-eyed recognition of reality. "Early in my career, I made a decision that I wouldn't take roles that demeaned black people. That limited my options initially, but it was non-negotiable for me." Marcus nodded slowly, beginning to understand something profound about Denzel's approach to his career and life. "You set boundaries based on values, not just opportunities." "Exactly," Denzel affirmed. "Success without integrity isn't success at all. It's just achievement empty of meaning." He shifted slightly in his seat, his expression reflective. "I've turned down roles that would have paid well but contradicted what I stand for. I've chosen projects because they said something I felt needed saying, even when they weren't the most commercial options." "That takes courage," Marcus observed. "Or stubbornness," Denzel replied with a soft chuckle. "My agent might use different words sometimes." They shared a quiet laugh, careful not to disturb the sleeping cabin. "But here's the thing," Denzel continued, his expression growing thoughtful again. "Those choices, the ones based on values rather than pure strategic advantage, they're the ones I've never regretted. Even when a project didn't succeed by conventional measures, I could look at myself in the mirror knowing I'd acted with integrity." The flight attendant passed by again, checking that all was well. In the brief pause, Marcus reflected on his own career choices. How many decisions had he made solely based on advancement, compensation, or status? How many times had he compromised his values, or worse, failed to consider them at all, in pursuit of success as defined by others? "I've always approached my career like a chess game," Marcus admitted when they were alone again. "Every move calculated for maximum advantage. It's been effective in many ways, but—" He trailed off, unsure how to articulate the emptiness he'd begun to recognize. "But effectiveness isn't the only measure of a good life," Denzel finished for him. "Exactly." Marcus nodded, grateful for the articulation. "I'm successful by every external metric, yet something feels missing." Denzel was quiet. For a moment, his expression suggesting he was carefully considering his next words. You know, I've played a lot of characters over the years, men of great achievement, men who lost everything, men facing impossible choices. The common thread I've found is that a life driven solely by achievement ultimately rings hollow. What's the alternative? Marcus asked. Purpose, Denzel said simply, knowing that what you do matters beyond yourself. That your work, your presence in the world contributes something meaningful. That sounds, Marcus searched for the right word, idealistic. Maybe, Denzel acknowledged with a small smile, but I've found it to be intensely practical. Purpose gets you through the inevitable failures and setbacks. It sustains you when external validation disappears, which it always does, eventually. Marcus thought about his own career trajectory. The promotions, the bonuses, the accolades, each had provided a momentary high that quickly faded, leaving him hungry for the next achievement. I had a role once, Denzel continued, where I played a man who spent his whole life climbing a ladder, only to discover it was leaning against the wrong wall. That image has stayed with me. Success is meaningless if it's taking you somewhere you don't actually want to go. The metaphor struck Marcus with unexpected force. Was he climbing the wrong ladder? Had he been so focused on the climb itself that he'd failed to consider where it was leading? How do you know if your ladder is against the right wall? Marcus asked, the question emerging from a place of genuine uncertainty. You ask yourself what truly matters to you, not what you've been told should matter, but what resonates in your core. Denzel's gaze was direct but kind, and you consider how you want to be remembered when your time is done, not for your titles or possessions, but for your impact on others. Marcus fell silent, absorbing these words. The cabin around them hummed, with the white noise of flight, creating a cocoon of privacy in the public space. I'll share something with you, Denzel said after a moment. Something a wise man once told me when I was starting out. He said, Denzel, you'll never see a U-Haul behind a hearse. Marcus couldn't help but smile at the vivid image, meaning you can't take it with you. Exactly. So the question becomes, what are you leaving behind? What ripples have you created in other lives that continue after you're gone? Denzel's expression was earnest. That's the true measure of a life well lived. The dawn light began to penetrate the edges of the window shades, signaling the approach of morning and their destination. Soon the cabin would awaken, the intimate bubble of their conversation would dissolve, and they would return to their separate lives. But Marcus knew something had fundamentally shifted for him during this nighttime exchange. I appreciate your willingness to share these perspectives with me, Marcus said, his tone free of the defensive edge that had characterized his earlier interactions, especially after how I initially spoke to you. That's the beauty of new encounters, Denzel replied. There are always opportunities for reset, for seeing differently. I believe people can change their perspective at any point if they're willing to be honest with themselves. The flight attendant's voice came softly over the intercom, announcing that breakfast would be served shortly, and asking passengers to indicate their preferences. Around them, the cabin began to stir, passengers adjusting their seats, removing eye masks, preparing to rejoin the waking world. As the plane continued its approach toward the east coast and the rising sun, Marcus felt as though he too was approaching. A new dawn, one that offered the possibility of seeing his life, his work, and his measure of success in a fundamentally different light. The cabin gradually awakened as the flight attendants prepared for breakfast service. Overhead lights brightened incrementally. Window shades rose, revealing the pink-orange glow of dawn spreading across the horizon, and the gentle sounds of passengers stirring filled the space that had been quiet for hours. Marcus accepted a coffee, its rich aroma providing a welcome jolt after the night of minimal sleep and maximal introspection. Denzel declined the coffee but accepted orange juice, his movements displaying the practiced ease of someone accustomed to long flights and early mornings. Despite the overnight journey, he appeared remarkably composed, a stark contrast to many of the other passengers with their rumpled clothes and sleep-creased faces. "Do you know what you'll have for breakfast?" Marcus asked, scanning the menu. Card the flight attendant had provided. "The omelette, I think," Denzel replied. "After all these years of traveling, I've learned that eggs are usually the safest bet on planes. Marcus nodded, appreciating this small, practical wisdom. I'll go with that too, then. Their conversation had shifted to lighter topics as the cabin came alive around them. Favorite places they'd traveled, books they'd enjoyed recently, the changing landscape of their respective industries. Yet Marcus noticed a difference in his own engagement. He was listening more actively, less focused on steering the conversation toward topics that might benefit him, more interested in Denzel's actual perspectives rather than what could be gained from them. It was a subtle shift but meaningful. For perhaps the first time in years, Marcus was having a conversation purely for its own sake, not as a strategic maneuver in his ongoing campaign for advancement. Their breakfast trays had just been served when a commotion several rows behind them broke the routine calm of the cabin. A woman's voice, high with panic, cut through the ambient noise. "Help, something's wrong with my husband." Marcus turned in his seat, as did most of the passengers. Several rows back, a woman in her 60s was frantically trying to rouse an elderly man slumped beside her, his face ashen, his body unnaturally still. "He's not responding," she cried, her voice trembling. "Please, someone help." The lead flight attendant rushed toward them, her professional demeanor intensifying. "Is there a doctor on board?" she called out, scanning the cabin. "Any medical professionals, please identify yourselves." Marcus watched, his breakfast forgotten, as the scene unfolded. His first reaction, he was somewhat ashamed to realize, was annoyance at the disruption. His second thought was relief that the situation wasn't happening in his immediate vicinity, allowing him to maintain a comfortable distance from the crisis. But then something unexpected happened. Without fanfare or hesitation, Denzel Washington unbuckled his seatbelt and stood. "I'm not a doctor," he said to the flight attendant, his voice calm but carrying authority. "But I've had emergency response training. May I help?" The flight attendant nodded gratefully, and Denzel moved toward the distressed couple, his manner purposeful but unhurried. Marcus watched, surprised by this voluntary entry into a situation most first-class passengers would be relieved to avoid. "Sir, can you hear me?" Denzel's voice was clear and steady as he approached the unresponsive man. He knelt in the aisle, beside the passenger's seat, immediately checking for a pulse at the man's wrist and then neck. The wife hovered nearby, fear evident in every line of her body. "He has a heart condition," she explained, her words tumbling out rapidly. "He took his medication before the flight, but when exactly did he become unresponsive?" Denzel asked, his tone gentle but focused. "Just now, just a minute ago," she replied. "He was fine, and then he said he felt dizzy, and then he just—" She gestured helplessly at her husband's slumped form. Another passenger, a woman in her 40s, approached. "I'm a nurse," she said, joining Denzel beside the unresponsive man. Marcus continued to watch from his seat, struck by the calm efficiency with which Denzel had inserted himself into the crisis. There was no hesitation, no concern about maintaining celebrity distance, no worry about the disruption to his own journey, just immediate, practical response to another person's need. The flight attendants had brought the plane's emergency medical kit, and the nurse and Denzel worked together to assess the man's condition. Marcus couldn't hear everything being said, but he could see Denzel supporting the elderly man's head while the nurse checked his vital signs. "The captain needs to know if we should divert," the lead flight attendant said, her voice carrying the weight of urgency. "His pulse is weak but present," the nurse replied. "Breathing is shallow. Given his cardiac history, this could be serious." Another flight attendant was speaking rapidly into a phone, presumably communicating with the cockpit. The rest of the cabin had gone quiet, passengers watching the drama unfold with the mixed fascination and discomfort that public emergencies often evoke. Marcus found himself struck not just by Denzel's willingness to help, but by the quality of his presence in the crisis. There was no performative aspect to his assistance, no sense that he was aware of being observed. He was simply there, fully present to the situation at hand, focusing entirely on the needs of the moment. After several tense minutes, the elderly man began to regain consciousness, his eyes fluttering open. A collective sigh of relief rippled through the cabin. The nurse continued to monitor his vitals, while Denzel spoke gently to him, helping him orient to his surroundings. "We're on a flight to New York," Denzel explained, his tone reassuring. "You seem to have had a fainting spell. There's a nurse here helping you, and the flight crew is going to make sure you get medical attention as soon as we land." The man nodded weakly, his gaze unfocused but gradually clearing. His wife clutched his hand, tears of relief streaming down her face. "Thank you," she said, looking between Denzel and the nurse. "Thank you both so much." The nurse nodded professionally, continuing her assessment. Denzel simply placed a reassuring hand on the woman's shoulder briefly before stepping back to allow the medical professional more space to work. As Denzel made his way back to his seat, several passengers murmured thanks or acknowledgement. He responded with modest nods, accepting their recognition without seeking it. "That was quite something," Marcus said, as Denzel settled back beside him. "Anyone would have helped," Denzel replied, the simplicity of his response underlining its sincerity. "No," Marcus said, shaking his head slightly. "Most people wouldn't have. Most people, myself included, would have stayed in their seats, relieved it wasn't their problem to solve." Denzel considered this, taking a sip of his now cold orange juice before responding. "Maybe. But I've found that stepping toward problems, rather than away from them, is usually the right choice, even when it's uncomfortable." The comment wasn't delivered as a lesson or moral instruction, but Marcus felt its weight nonetheless. In that moment, he recognized yet another dimension of Denzel's character that challenged his own assumptions, not just about success or status, but about basic human responsibility. "The captain has announced we'll be expediting our arrival into JFK," the flight attendant informed the cabin. "Medical personnel will meet the aircraft. Please remain seated when we land until the affected passenger has been assisted." Marcus glanced at his watch, calculating the impact on his morning schedule. A meeting with potential investors at 9:30, a strategy session at 11 Marquise. Both would need to be rescheduled if the landing was significantly delayed. Then, catching himself in this familiar pattern of prioritizing his schedule over others' well-being, he felt a twinge of embarrassment. Here was a man potentially fighting for his life just a few rows away, and Marcus's first concern was for his calendar. "Sometimes we need reminders of what truly matters," Denzel said quietly, as if reading Marcus's thoughts. "Moments like these have a way of cutting through the noise." Marcus nodded, struck by the simple truth of the observation. "You're right," he acknowledged. "It certainly puts my morning meetings in perspective." As the plane began its descent toward New York, the elderly passenger remained stable, attended by the nurse and flight crew. The crisis appeared to be resolving as well as could be expected under the circumstances. Yet for Marcus, its impact lingered, not just in the drama of the medical emergency itself, but in the vivid demonstration of character he had witnessed. Denzel's immediate, unself-conscious response revealed a basic orientation toward others that transcended status, convenience, or public image. It was, Marcus realized, yet another manifestation of the values Denzel had articulated in their earlier conversation, the prioritization of human needs over personal convenience, of contribution over calculation. The plane began its final approach into JFK, the sprawling metropolis of New York City, emerging through wisps of morning clouds below. The medical situation had stabilized, with the elderly passenger now conscious and under the watchful eye of the flight attendants and the nurse who had volunteered her expertise. A palpable sense of relief had settled over the cabin. Passengers, returning to their routines of gathering belongings and preparing for landing. Marcus watched as Denzel discreetly checked on the man one last time before returning to his seat for the descent. The action was simple but spoke volumes, a genuine concern that extended beyond the immediate crisis to ensure the passengers' continued well-being. "They'll have paramedics waiting at the gate," Denzel said as he buckled his seatbelt. "He seems stable now, but that kind of episode needs proper medical follow-up." Marcus nodded, struck again by the practical wisdom in Denzel's approach. "Have you had medical training?" he asked, curious about the confidence with which Denzel had responded to the emergency. "Basic first aid, CPR, that sort of thing," Denzel replied. "I've done a few roles that required understanding emergency response, but more importantly, my father was a minister who ran a water treatment facility. He taught me that knowledge isn't much use if you don't apply it when needed. Your father sounds like a remarkable man, Marcus observed. He was, Denzel agreed, a warm respect evident in his tone. Worked 2 jobs most of his life, never complained. He believed in service above self, not in a self-sacrificing way, but as a natural expression of being part of a community. The plane banked slightly, aligning with the runway, the seatbelt sign illuminating with a soft chime. Around them, passengers shifted in their seats, preparing for touchdown. My father had different ideas, Marcus found himself saying, surprising. Himself with the personal disclosure. He was a corporate attorney, brilliant at what he did, but he paused, searching for the right words. Success was everything to him. Status, recognition, financial achievement. Nothing else really registered. Denzel listened attentively, his expression open rather than judging. He used to take me to his firm's holiday parties when I was a kid, Marcus continued, the memory suddenly vivid. He'd introduce me to the partners, telling them I'd be joining their ranks someday. I was 7, 8 years old, already being groomed for a specific kind of success. And you followed that path? Denzel asked. Not exactly. I went into tech instead of law, which initially felt like rebellion. Marcus smiled ruefully at the thought. But I realize now I absorbed his fundamental values completely. Achievement at all costs, status as the primary measure of worth. Just in a different industry. The plane touched down with a gentle thud, tires making contact with the runway in that moment of transition from air to earth. Marcus felt a parallel transition happening within himself, from performance to authenticity, from strategic calculation to genuine connection. That's the thing about fathers, Denzel observed as the aircraft decelerated. Their influence runs deeper than we realize, either in following their example or defining ourselves in opposition to it. Did you follow your father's example? Marcus asked. In some ways, Denzel replied thoughtfully, not in his specific path. He wanted me to become a preacher like him, but in his core values, integrity, service, treating all people with dignity, regardless of status. He paused, a smile touching his eyes. Though I'm sure he would have had plenty to say about some of the roles I've played. The plane taxied toward the terminal, morning sunlight streaming through the windows as passengers began retrieving items from overhead compartments despite the flight attendants' requests to remain seated. It's strange, Marcus said, watching the ground crew position themselves for the plane's arrival. I've spent my career cultivating a certain image, playing a role almost as much as you do in your films. But the difference is, you know you're playing a character. I've somehow convinced myself the role is who I actually am. Denzel nodded, understanding in his expression. That's a powerful realization. So who am I beneath all that? Marcus asked, the question emerging from a place of genuine uncertainty, rather than rhetorical effect. That, Denzel said with a gentle smile, is a question only you can answer. But recognizing that there's a difference between your performed self and your authentic self is an important first step. The plane came to a complete stop at the gate, the captain's voice announcing their arrival and thanking them for flying. As promised, paramedics were waiting to board and attend to the elderly passenger, the flight attendants efficiently organizing priority deplaning for those in need of immediate assistance. We'll need to remain seated until they've taken care of the medical situation, Denzel observed, settling back in his seat. Marcus nodded, for once unbothered by the delay. The urgency he typically felt upon landing, the rush to be first off. The plane, first to the baggage claim, first in the taxi line, had dissipated. Instead, he felt a strange sense of calm, an unusual willingness to simply be present in the moment. You know, Marcus said after a comfortable silence, I can't remember the last time I had a conversation like this, one that wasn't about networking or advancing some agenda. Those are rare in any context, Denzel agreed, but especially valuable because of that rarity. I suppose that's why people treasure your films, Marcus observed. They create a connection that goes beyond entertainment. At their best, yes, Denzel said, though it's not always something you can plan or engineer. The most meaningful connections, in art or in life, often happen when you're focused on truth rather than effect. Marcus considered this, recognizing its application beyond filmmaking to his own life and work. How often had he focused on effect, the impression he was making, the advantage he was gaining rather than truth? "I've been thinking about what you said earlier," Marcus said, "about success being a responsibility rather than a destination. I'm beginning to understand what you meant." The paramedics had boarded now, making their way to the elderly passenger. The cabin remained quiet, passengers respecting the gravity of the situation despite their usual eagerness to deplane. "It's taken me years to fully grasp it myself," Denzel admitted, "and I'm still learning how to live it out consistently." "That's oddly reassuring," Marcus said with a small smile. "To know that even Denzel Washington doesn't have it all figured out." Denzel laughed, the sound genuine and warm. "Far from it. Life is more about the journey than the destination." Another cliché that happens to be true. They watched as the paramedics efficiently assessed the elderly man, transferred him to a wheelchair, and prepared to escort him from the aircraft. His wife followed closely, her face etched with concern, but also profound relief. As the medical team passed their row, the wife paused, her gaze finding Denzel. "Thank you again," she said simply. "Your kindness made all the difference." Denzel nodded, his expression warm. "I'm glad he's in good hands now. Take care of each other." The genuine exchange, brief but meaningful, struck Marcus deeply. This was connection in its purest form, human to human without pretense or agenda. As the plane began to empty, passengers finally released to continue their journeys, Marcus found himself reluctant for this unexpected encounter to end. Their paths had crossed by chance, but the impact felt significant, potentially lasting. "I know this might sound strange," Marcus said, gathering his courage along with his belongings, "but would you be open to continuing this conversation sometime? Not for networking or anything like that," he added quickly, "but because I think I have a lot more to learn from your perspective." Denzel considered him for a moment, his gaze thoughtful but not dismissive. Then, reaching into his pocket, he retrieved a small notebook and pen. He wrote something on a page, tore it out and handed it to Marcus. "My personal email," he said. "Not one that goes through assistants or managers. If you want to continue the conversation, reach out. Just—" He smiled slightly. "Give me a few weeks. I've got a film starting production soon." Marcus accepted the paper, surprised and touched by the gesture. "Thank you," he said simply. "I will." As they finally rose to leave the aircraft, Marcus realized that more had changed during this flight than just his understanding of success or his recognition of Denzel Washington. Something fundamental had shifted in his orientation toward others, a willingness to see and be seen that had long been absent from his carefully constructed life. It was, he realized, the beginning of an authentic connection, not just with Denzel, but with parts of himself he had long ago forgotten or suppressed. The morning sunlight streamed through the terminal windows as passengers dispersed into the bustling activity of JFK. Marcus and Denzel walked together through the jetway and into the terminal, their pace unhurried compared to the rushed frenzy of travelers around them. For once, Marcus wasn't checking his phone, wasn't mentally prioritizing emails or strategizing his next meeting. Instead, he found himself fully present in this transitional moment, aware of the significance it held. "Do you have someone meeting?" "You?" Denzel asked as they approached the main concourse. "A car service," Marcus replied. "Though I'm considering canceling my morning meetings. After last night, I could use some time to process." The admission that something might take precedence over his carefully scheduled professional obligations felt foreign, yet strangely liberating. Denzel nodded approvingly. "Sometimes the most productive thing we can do is pause." They continued walking, passing gate after gate of departing flights. Occasional glances of recognition followed Denzel, subtle double-takes, whispered comments between companions, but most travelers were too absorbed in their own journeys to notice the celebrated actor in their midst. For those who did recognize him, Denzel acknowledged them with a simple nod or smile, neither seeking attention nor avoiding it. Marcus observed this with new awareness, noting how Denzel maintained his dignity and accessibility simultaneously. There was a lesson here, too, one about moving through the world with an identity that was neither defined by external recognition nor diminished by its absence. As they approached the security exit, Marcus knew their paths would soon diverge. His car would take him to Manhattan, to his penthouse apartment, with its carefully curated furnishings and impressive views. Denzel would continue to whatever awaited him in New York, family perhaps, or professional obligations related to his upcoming production. "Before we part ways," Marcus said, slowing his pace, "I want to thank you properly." Denzel glanced at him curiously. "For what specifically?" "For your patience," Marcus began. "For not dismissing me after my initial behavior. For sharing perspectives that have challenged me." He paused, searching for the right words. "Most people in your position would have shut down the conversation or put me in my place. Instead, you engaged thoughtfully, even generously." Denzel's expression was warm but modest. "We all deserve the chance to move beyond first impressions." "That's just it," Marcus continued, feeling an urgency to articulate something important before their encounter ended. "I'm not sure I've extended that same courtesy to others. I've been quick to judge, to categorize people based on their utility, to me or their status markers. Our conversation has made me question that entire approach." They had stopped walking now, standing to the side of the busy corridor as travelers flowed around them like a stream around stones. "Recognition is the first step toward change," Denzel said, echoing his earlier wisdom. "What matters now is what you do with that awareness." Marcus nodded, feeling both the weight and the potential of this truth. "I've been thinking about that, about concrete changes I might make." "Such as?" Denzel prompted. "For starters, reassessing my relationships," Marcus said, the words emerging with a clarity that surprised him. "I have colleagues, business associates, networking contacts, but few genuine connections. I've prioritized strategic value over authentic engagement for so long that I'm not sure I remember how to do it differently." Denzel listened attentively, his presence a calm center amid the airport's chaos. "And professionally," Marcus continued, "I've been so focused on climbing the ladder that I've never questioned whether it's leading somewhere I actually want to go, whether the work itself has meaning beyond advancement and compensation." "These are profound realizations," Denzel observed, "the kind that can redirect a life's course if taken seriously." "That's what I'm afraid of," Marcus admitted with a rueful smile, "that I'll return to my normal environment and these insights will fade, overwhelmed by habit and expectation." "Change isn't easy," Denzel acknowledged, "especially when it challenges not just your habits, but your identity. Who we think we are becomes comfortable, even when it's not serving us well." Marcus nodded, recognizing the truth in this. His identity as a high-achieving, ruthlessly efficient executive had been carefully constructed over years. Questioning, it meant entering uncertain territory, risking the very foundations of how he understood himself and his place in the world. "How did you maintain your authentic self?" Marcus asked. "In an industry that must constantly pressure you to conform to others' expectations?" Denzel considered the question carefully before responding. "I made decisions early on about what was non-negotiable for me, the roles I would or wouldn't take, the way I would treat people regardless of their position, the priorities that would guide my choices." He paused. "Those boundaries have been tested many times, but having them clearly defined has made the difficult choices easier." "Non-negotiables," Marcus repeated, considering what his own might be or should be. "And purpose," Denzel added, "knowing why I'm doing what I'm doing beyond the obvious rewards. For me, it's about meaningful storytelling, about creating work that might in some small way expand people's understanding of themselves and others." A boarding announcement echoed through the terminal, momentarily drowning their conversation in airport noise. When it faded, Marcus felt a renewed sense of the brevity of their encounter and the importance of what he wanted to say. "I owe you an apology," he said, his tone sincere rather than performative. "A real one, not just for social smoothing. The way I spoke to you initially, the assumptions I made, the condescension, it revealed something unflattering about my character. Not just a momentary lapse, but a pattern I've developed and justified over time." Denzel's expression remained open, neither dismissing the apology nor dwelling unnecessarily on the offense. "I judged you without knowing you," Marcus continued. "I assigned value based on superficial criteria, And I'm genuinely sorry for that, not just because you turned out to be someone whose opinion I respect, but because no one deserves that kind of treatment regardless of who they are. The apology hung between them, honest and unadorned. Marcus realized that for perhaps the first time in years, he was speaking without strategic calculation, without considering what he might gain or lose through the interaction. It was simply truth, offered with no expectation beyond its own expression. Denzel extended his hand. "Apology accepted," he said simply, "though I'd suggest that forgiving yourself might be the more challenging task." Marcus shook his hand, feeling a shift within himself. Not a complete transformation, but the beginning of one. A crack in the facade he had maintained for so long, allowing something more authentic to emerge. "This is where we part ways," Denzel said, gesturing toward the exit where his own transportation likely waited. "But hopefully not the end of the conversation. I'll email you," Marcus promised, "after your production starts, and I'll have more to share than just gratitude by then." "I hope," Denzel smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his already remarkable face. "I look forward to it." Then with a final nod, he turned and moved toward the exit, his unhurried pace and natural dignity creating a small ripple of awareness through the crowded terminal. Marcus watched him go, feeling both the conclusion of this unexpected encounter and the beginning of something new within himself. The transformation wasn't complete. Such fundamental shifts never happen in a single moment or conversation, but the foundation had been laid, the possibility established. As he finally turned toward his own exit, Marcus pulled out his phone. Instead of checking emails or his calendar, he opened his contacts and scrolled to a name he hadn't called in months, his younger brother, with whom he'd grown distant as his career had accelerated. The relationship had been categorized as non-essential in his ruthlessly efficient approach to life management. Now, with newfound clarity, he pressed the call button, ready for a different kind of connection, one based not on utility or obligation, but on genuine human value. The phone rang as he stepped into the morning light of New York City, a man, subtly but significantly changed, from the one who had boarded a plane in Los Angeles just hours before. The New York morning enveloped Marcus as he stepped outside the terminal, the familiar cacophony of honking taxis, rumbling luggage carts, hand-urgent announcements fading behind him. His brother had answered on the third ring, surprised but pleased to hear from him. They'd arranged to meet for dinner that evening, a simple plan that somehow felt more significant than the high-stakes business meetings Marcus had postponed. His driver spotted him and stepped forward to take his bag. "Good morning, Mr. Grayson. Straight to your apartment." Marcus nodded, settling into the back seat of the black sedan. As the car pulled away from the curb, he watched the airport recede in the rear window, thinking about the boundary between the experience he'd just had and the life he was returning to. How often had he made this journey from airport to apartment, his mind already racing ahead to negotiations and strategy sessions, barely noticing the transition. Today, he felt each moment of the passage with unusual clarity. His phone buzzed, with notifications, emails accumulating during the flight, meeting reminders, market updates, news alerts. The familiar pull of urgency tugged at him, the habitual response to immediately dive in, to rejoin the slipstream of information and action that defined his normal existence. Instead, he put the phone away. "Actually," he said to the driver, leaning slightly forward, "could we take the long way through Queens? I'm in no rush this morning." The driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror, surprise flickering briefly across his face. Marcus Grayson was known for his efficiency, his impatience with delays. "Of course, sir. Any particular route?" "Wherever there's less traffic," Marcus replied. "I'd just like to see some of the city." As they drove through neighborhoods Marcus had passed countless times but never really seen, he found himself noticing details: children walking to school, shopkeepers raising security gates, elderly men playing chess in a park. The ordinary pageant of human life unfolding outside his usual field of vision. His mind returned to Denzel's words about success as responsibility rather than destination. What responsibility did he have? Not just professionally to shareholders and colleagues, but as a human being occupying space in this densely interconnected world. He'd always justified his focus on achievement as necessary, the price of excellence. But what if that single-minded pursuit had blinded him to other forms of value and connection? The car approached Manhattan, the iconic skyline rising before them. Among those gleaming towers was the office where Marcus had spent countless hours, climbing the corporate ladder, strategizing his next move, outmaneuvering competitors both external and internal. He felt a strange detachment from that version of himself now. Not rejection, but perspective, as though seeing a familiar landscape from a new elevation. "We're approaching your building, sir," the driver said, navigating toward the luxury high-rise, where Marcus's penthouse occupied the top floor. "Thank you," Marcus replied, then added something he couldn't remember saying to a driver before. "What's your name?" The man's eyes met his briefly in the mirror. "Eduardo, sir." "Thank you, Eduardo. I appreciate the ride." It was a small gesture, this acknowledgement of the person behind the service, but it felt like a concrete expression of his emerging awareness. The kind of awareness Denzel had demonstrated consistently, seeing people as individuals worthy of respect regardless of their utility or status. As the car pulled up to his building, the doorman rushed forward to open the door. "Welcome back, Mr. Grayson." "Thank you, James," Marcus replied, using the doorman's name for the first time in the 3 years he'd lived in the building. The man's momentary surprise was quickly masked by professional composure, but Marcus noticed it, another small indication of how rarely he had extended even this basic courtesy. His apartment welcomed him with its perfect, impersonal elegance, the carefully curated furniture selected by a designer, the abstract art chosen more for investment value than personal resonance, the immaculate surfaces maintained by a cleaning service he rarely saw. It was, he realized, a space designed to impress rather than comfort, to showcase achievement rather than nurture humanity. Marcus moved to the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the city. From this height, people were reduced to moving dots, cars to toys, the messy vitality of human existence abstracted into pattern and flow. It was a perspective that reinforced detachment, superiority, the illusion of mastery. He thought about Denzel's manner throughout their encounter, how present he had been, how engaged with the immediate reality of each moment, whether conversing with Marcus or assisting the ill passenger. There had been no sense of hierarchical thinking in his interactions, no calculation of relative status or advantage. Just human-to-human connection, authentic and direct. The contrast with Marcus's habitual mode was stark and uncomfortable to acknowledge. His phone vibrated again, a text from his assistant. "Investors asking to reschedule for tomorrow. Critical. They meet before deciding on Series D participation. Please advise." 6 hours ago, Marcus would have immediately prioritized this meeting over everything else. Now he found himself weighing it differently, considering costs beyond the merely professional. "Tell them I can do 2 p.m. tomorrow," he texted back. "Family commitment this evening, family commitment." The phrase felt foreign yet right, an acknowledgement that some relationships deserved priority, not because of what they could provide, but because of what they intrinsically were. Marcus showered and changed, the familiar routines carrying a different quality today. As he dressed in casual clothes rather than his usual business attire, he caught sight of himself in the mirror and paused, really looking at his reflection. Who was he beneath the carefully constructed exterior? What values truly guided him beyond achievement and advancement? What did he want his life to mean beyond the accumulation of status and wealth? These questions had been awakened by his conversation with Denzel, but answering them would be his own journey, one that couldn't be completed in a day or even a year, but would require ongoing commitment to awareness and choice. His brother had suggested meeting at a neighborhood restaurant in Brooklyn, not the type of exclusive venue Marcus typically frequented, but a place with history for them. They had eaten there together during Christopher's first year of graduate school, before Marcus's career had accelerated and their paths had diverged. As Marcus left his apartment and headed for the subway rather than calling his usual car service, he felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in years. Not because his life had suddenly simplified or his ingrained habits had magically transformed, but because he had taken the first step toward living with greater awareness, toward choices aligned with deeper values than mere advancement. The subway car was crowded with afternoon commuters, a cross-section of humanity pressed together in temporary community. Marcus found himself observing faces, noting expressions, wondering about the individual lives briefly intersecting with his own. Where once he might have felt impatience or disdain for this mode of transport, he now experienced a curious sense of connection to the shared human experience surrounding him. When he emerged from the station in Brooklyn, the neighborhood's energy enveloped him, less polished than his usual haunts, but vibrant with authentic life. People of various ages and backgrounds populated the sidewalks, none of them concerned with the status markers Marcus had learned to prioritize. He spotted his brother waiting outside the restaurant, looking both familiar and strange after their months of limited contact. Christopher's smile of greeting was tentative, suggesting uncertainty about this unexpected reconnection. "Marcus," he said, extending his hand, "this is a surprise, a good one." Instead of the handshake, Marcus pulled his brother into a brief embrace. "It's good to see you, Chris, really good." Christopher's surprise was evident, but he returned the hug before pulling back to study Marcus's face. "You look different." "Did something happen?" Marcus smiled, considering how to explain the transformation beginning within him, how a chance encounter on a flight had initiated a fundamental reconsideration of his values and priorities. "Let's go inside," he said. "I've got a story to tell you." As they entered the restaurant, Marcus knew that the path ahead wouldn't be simple or straightforward. Old habits would reassert themselves. The culture of achievement and status he had so fully embraced would continue to exert its pull. But something essential had shifted. A new awareness had taken root, offering the possibility of choices guided by deeper values than those that had driven him for so long. It wasn't an ending, but a beginning, the first step in a longer journey toward authentic success, meaningful connection, and a life defined by its impact rather than its acquisitions. The transformation had begun.